Well, hey there, everyone. Welcome back into another episode of the Winsome Creationist. I'm joined by a new guest and who I'm sure is going to become a fast friend, Michael Zwaagstra. Michael, good to see you.
Well, good to see you, Steve. It's a pleasure to be able to join you on your podcast.
Yeah, I am thrilled. So we have a mutual friend, Dustin Burlett, who has been on the podcast before, and he has brought your name up to me at least 3 or 4 times, probably more than that. And I've been dragging my feet, so I'm sorry about that. I've had a lot going on, but I'm thrilled to have you here, and I can't wait to dive into more about your story. So maybe just, if you wouldn't mind, just kind of like, let's dive in a little bit. Who are you? Why should anybody care? Why are we talking? And I'd love to go from there.
Oh, sure. Well, just a little bit of background of myself. I'm Canadian. I live in Steinbach, Manitoba, and Steinbach is about 45 minutes southeast of Winnipeg. And in terms of what I do for a living, I am a high school teacher. I teach mainly social studies, so teaches like courses like Canadian history, American history. I teach law, world religions, ethics, so we have a lot of interesting discussions. And I've been teaching a long time. I'm heading into my 25th year of teaching in the public school system. I'm also a city councilor here in Steinbach. I'm currently the deputy mayor, and I've been on council since 2006, so I also have a political angle. And I also do a lot of writing, both mainly on education policy for various think tanks, most notably the Fraser Institute. And so I write a lot on public education, independent schools, different things about curriculum and testing and standards. And that's sort of what I do professionally. And then I also teach courses on an adjunct basis here at Steinbach Bible College, which is a local Anabaptist Bible college. And I've taught courses on a variety of topics, but mainly a lot of these 3 views and 4 views type of courses. And last year, the most recent course that I did was called 3 Views on Creation and Evolution. And so I know that we're going to be talking about creationism, and I'm happy to give you some of my background and my interest in the topic. But that's just a quick synopsis in terms of some of the things that I do. I'm also a member of Steinbach Mennonite Brethren Church. I teach adult Sunday school every week, and so typically we're going through a book of the Bible. We just finished a series on 1st and 2nd Kings. Had a lot of fun with that, and then we'll be going on to a new book this fall. So definitely have a lot of things going on, and so happy to be able to chat with you.
No, I love it. You're a lot like me in that regard. If I didn't have a million things going on, I wouldn't know what to do with my life or my time. And by the way, a bit of advice: if I were you, I would start announcing when people say, "What do you do?" I would say, "I am a philosopher of politics and education." That's what I would tell them. I think.
Yeah, well, it's philosopher has its own different connotations. So. But definitely, it's good to be involved and to be active. I mean, I think as Christians, that's what we should be doing. We should be using our talents and our gifts and serving the church and the community. And I think it's important for Christians to be involved in the community, not just in church, although church we should be involved in, but also in the outside world, the secular world, if we want to use that terminology, because I think that as Christians, we have more credibility when we're actively engaged with the broader world and not simply surrounding ourselves with like-minded people.
Oh, I totally agree. I mean, I think one of the biggest mistakes that Christians have made is to compartmentalize, right, religion and what we do with the rest of our lives, right? Ideally, we need to think in a Christian way about everything in our lives. I mean, it's that way for me with business. Business is a huge part of my life. And if I just treated business like something that happened completely aside or separate from my Christian worldview, I wouldn't be taking a very Christian approach to business. And so I'm actually not sure, this might be a good segue, but there's a lot of, I guess you'd say, controversy around that idea when it actually comes to the topic of science and the Bible, isn't there? There's a lot of people who think that they basically don't get to, or they shouldn't even bring the Bible into the lab with them when they're doing scientific research. And, those just kind of tend to be the people who naturally separate their scientific conclusions from their biblical beliefs. I mean, ultimately they end up informing each other, but they're not used to factor in with what one believes. I mean, do you see problems with that? Have you noticed the same thing that I have there?
Yes, I have. And I think one of the biggest mistakes that Christians have made historically is just this artificial divide between secular and sacred, secular and spiritual. The reality is that all jobs are secular and all jobs are spiritual. It's just as spiritual to be working in business or to be working as a teacher or as a nurse or in construction as it is to be a pastor or missionary. And this, even if we don't say it openly, so many Christians, we kind of have this idea that, you're really spiritual if you're in the mission field, and you're kind of spiritual in your business as long as you're donating your money to the mission field, because that's where the real ministry happens. And,
Right.
just as a quick segue here, if you look at the example of the Apostle Paul, if you read the book of Acts, he spent a lot of his time in hard manual labor. He was a tent maker. That was his profession. God didn't just drop money out of the sky so that way he could do more ministry, as we call it. Paul had to actually work with his hands, and I suspect he made very good quality leather tents because otherwise people wouldn't have taken him seriously. And so as Christians,
Mhm.
we should be engaged in the world, whether it's in business or in education or whatever field that it is, and we should be doing well at it because people are far more likely to take our witness seriously if we're actually good at our jobs.
It's so true. It's so true. And one little side note there, I already feel like I could talk to you for hours. This could be dangerous. But one little side note there is, it's interesting to me that the Bible endorses both models. The Bible endorses both, having a business or some kind of vocational activity that supports your efforts of preaching and teaching the Bible. But there is also a biblical category for being supported by those whom you teach or preach to. And it doesn't necessarily say that one is more morally right than the other and one is more spiritual than the other or anything. They're both just different biblical models that different people used for different reasons. And the Bible seems to be okay with both of those. So I think we demonize people on one way or the other sometimes when I think we shouldn't.
Yep. No, I totally agree. There is, those who preach the gospel, as Paul says, should earn their living by the gospel. So there is a case to be made for having, I believe in having full-time pastors. And I also believe in having Christians in full-time work outside of the church, because frankly, if we didn't have Christians in full-time work outside the church, there wouldn't be any money coming into the church. So there is also a
Amen. Yeah.
practical angle.
Yeah. Okay. Let me ask you a question on that, since we're kind of dancing around this. We're gonna get into the meat here real quick.
Yeah.
But so I'm curious on your thoughts, given your knowledge in this topic, on parachurch ministry. Okay, and this is not. I'm not picking on them when I say this. I'm just using this as an example because it's relevant to us and to this podcast. So me and my family just came back from a trip to the Creation Museum and the Ark Encounter. While I may not be the biggest fan of everything that comes out of those enterprises, generally speaking, I enjoy myself. I have a fun time when I'm there. I think they're great. And I think there are some people who would look at those things and say, well, yeah, they might be doing a great work for the Lord, but they're greedy. They take in millions of dollars per year. They have these big attractions. I'm just curious, and again, this is not to pick on them or anything. I actually believe in I really like a for-profit model. For some things that other people would take a nonprofit approach to, I actually really like a for-profit model because I believe in that value exchange. And so I'm just kind of curious where you land on that. I mean, do you think that it's okay for Christians to have sort of these parachurch ministries that are nonprofit, but also people seem to be making a pretty good profit off of them, personally speaking anyway? Do you think there's anything like morally questionable or biblically wrong with that, or do you think a case can be made for that to be okay? What do you think?
I think there's a reasonable case for it being okay. I actually visited the Ark Encounter with my family last year, and I certainly noticed when paying the admission fees and buying snacks there and all that, yep, I'm pretty sure that they're making a reasonable profit. I don't think there's any need for us to glamorize poverty in the sense of that, a ministry is only a true ministry if everyone is living at subsistence level. I've never believed that. I think that it's reasonable for people who are working in parachurch ministries to make a decent income. What level that is, that obviously depends. That's why it's important to have accountability, why you have boards of directors, and that's why I do think it's important for transparency and to have the numbers available so that people can check. But the fact that a parachurch ministry makes a reasonable income and supports itself through people making donations and paying entry fees and all that, I think that's reasonable as long as it's not taken to excess.
Yeah. Amen. Love it. What a great balanced approach. All right. So how did you get into this whole creation and evolution thing? Because you've got some interesting thoughts and opinions on this.
Well, it goes back to when I was 15 years old, and I actually remember it very well. I was in the summer between grade 9 and grade 10. And at that time, high school in Manitoba started in grade 10. So I was about to go to the big high school. And I was in a Christian bookstore, Hull's Christian bookstore, which we still have in Steinbach. And I was looking at some of the books, and I came across one book, Scientific Creationism, edited by Henry Morris. And I asked my mom, who was with me at the time, saying, you know what, I don't know anything about this topic. Would you be willing to buy this book for me? I'd be curious in reading it. And so she bought me the book and I started reading it. And I was like, whoa, this is amazing stuff, just in terms of how clearly Morris made the case. I knew nothing about this topic before. And when I read that book, I just jumped into the topic with zeal. I just thought that, wow, I mean, as long as someone reads this book or reads something like it, they'll immediately change their views to the creationist perspective. I was a little naive, I mean, which most people who are 15 years old, 14 or 15 as I was at the time, tend to be. But that's what got me initially interested in the topic. And I started reading more on it. And at the time, my part-time job, I was working as a paper boy. And one of the main things that I used my paper route money was to buy books on the topic of creationism. And so I bought, like a whole bunch of other books, by, for example, like Dwayne Gish and others. But I also made a personal rule for myself, going, you know what, I don't want to just read one side. So I started buying books that supported evolution, and also books that supported old Earth creationism. And I made it a personal rule to try to do a one-for-one basis, that for every book that I bought/read promoting the creationist perspective, I would also read/buy a book from the other perspective. And so that's why I own pretty much every book that had ever been written by Stephen Jay Gould, and I've read them all the way through. It's why I've read Richard Dawkins' books. And I actually, some of his earlier books in particular, The Blind Watchmaker, which I read twice through when I was in grade 11, I didn't agree with it, but wow, was it beautifully written. It's
Yeah.
Richard Dawkins is one of the most amazing writers. I think he went off the rails with the God Delusion. That book is not nearly at the standard level of writing that you find in The Blind Watchmaker and The Selfish Gene and The Extended Phenotype, his earlier books. Although, on a quick side note, Dawkins seems to have come to more common sense in the last couple of years in challenging some of the
Yeah.
woke stuff, and he's calling himself a cultural Christian, and he's not so hostile anymore. So it's interesting to see that circle. But anyway, going back to myself in high school, I just became very interested in the topic. I liked to discuss it with people. I had the zeal of sort of someone who wanted to argue about this topic, and so I had at the time, one of the people I delivered papers to was my high school biology teacher, and we would sort of banter about this because he disagreed with me on this topic. And I actually challenged him to a creation evolution debate in the high school, where during the lunch hour, which would be open to students and teachers, and we actually did it. It was at the end of grade 10. I was 15 years old, and I actually held my own reasonably well. I won't claim that I won the debate. And I made sure I told him, you don't give me any quarter, you go hard. And he did. I mean, he actually really went hard after me. And but it was just, again, the zeal that I had for the topic. And I sort of continued that in high school. Again, just this massive collection of books. I mean, I have obviously a lot more books now than I did then, but I had bought at least like 100 books on the creation evolution topic in high school. Again, that's mostly money that I just made from my paper route that largely went to buying books on this topic. When we'd go on a family road trip to different parts of the U.S., one of my highlights was going into some of the different bookstores, because there is more of a book selection on this topic than some of the bookstores we had in Canada. And so it was just my opportunity to buy more books on this topic. And so it's just something that I found very interesting, and it just kind of kept on reading about.
Yeah, that's incredible. The Dawkins thing, I just find that so interesting, right? How, I mean, Dawkins being one of the four horsemen of the new atheists, and Dawkins, I should say, and just, man, wild how he has shifted, because the whole new atheism movement. I mean, basically, if you could summarize it in one sentence, it is religion is dangerous.
Yeah.
And boy, Dawkins has really come around to have this cultural Christianity idea. It's really interesting. This notion that whether or not Christianity is true is a different question from whether or not we need it.
Yes.
And
Yep.
I've been telling people lately that I think what an opportunity to to uh, to say, well, it's a good thing that we needed it. Just so happens to be true. You know, like be able to give people a foundation for it, not just, oh, it's a good idea, the idea of Christianity, but the person behind Christianity, you know, Jesus Christ, and we can point people to him.
Yep.
So you challenged your professor to a creation debate in 10th grade. I mean, that's pretty awesome. That's crazy.
Yeah, it's very audacious. It's very I had a very high opinion of myself at the time, and I've
Yeah,
obviously learned, and I think I've become hopefully a little wiser as I've gotten older. That things aren't quite as simple and not quite as black and white as I thought back then. But I definitely I was definitely very bold. I mean, there aren't a lot of
yeah,
15-year-olds that are going to challenge their biology teacher and say, I want to have a debate on this topic. And but it was a lot of fun. It was very memorable. I still have sometimes people that'll come up to me because I still live in Steinbach. I mean, so there's people that
yeah.
were in high school with me I still see now, and they remember that. I mean, it's not the kind of thing that happens very often in high school.
Yeah, for sure. I'm curious what it was, because a lot of what we're going to talk about here is this idea of just, well, the idea of this podcast of being winsome. And side note, one topic I do want to cover very soon is there ever a case to be made for not being winsome, or at least what's the balance between when should you be winsome versus when should you stand a little firmer, or whatever that looks like. I would make the case that they're not mutually exclusive. But you mentioned this idea that you made a commitment that you were going to read as many books against the topic as you did for the topic, and that, my friend, is very unusual. I mean, did that come out of a raising, or like where did that come from, and how has that worked out for you?
Well, it came out of a desire to be accurate. And again, I won't claim that in high school because I did have tunnel vision. Even though I did read books from the other side, I look back on it now and that I was reading them through a lens. There's no question about it. I mean, there's a limit to
Sure.
how unbiased you could make yourself. But I did want to make sure that I understood other perspectives correctly. I didn't want to risk caricaturing it even back then. And I was very grateful for like another one of my teachers who was the school librarian at the time. Was a fellow Christian. He and I are still friends, and we actually attend the same church now. And he shared with me because he was a little more, like sort of middle of the road on this topic. And he shared with me, for example, the book Science Held Hostage, which was a critique of both secular atheism and young earth creationism, where it challenged some of the creationist arguments that were being used at that time. And that book
Mm.
kind of opened my eyes to, well, hold on a second here. Henry Morris isn't right about everything. I mean, the Institute for Creation Research, they're still publishing stuff that's not accurate. I mean, the sun actually isn't shrinking, and they should have dropped that moon dust, the dust on the moon argument a whole long time ago, and they shouldn't still
Yes.
be keeping that in their scientific creationism book and selling it. And that opened my eyes a little bit. So I'm really glad that I was reading stuff from other perspectives, because it helped me see that no, I can't just blindly accept, even if it's from someone who I'm predisposed to agree with ideologically and philosophically and all that, that they're not right about everything. And as much as I appreciated, the work of Henry Morris and Duane Gish and such, that actually they had blind spots as well. They had things that they got wrong, and that yeah. So you can't
Yeah.
just go to one group and assume that they're going to have everything.
Yeah, for sure. So for you, now I'm going to ask kind of a big question, but I think you'll be able to probably distill it down and articulate it as long as I can get the question out right. Maybe I should start it by framing it this way. So Todd Wood, I know I am a big fan of his work, and I think you'd mentioned that you like his work too, and
Yeah.
we could talk more specifically about that in a bit. But he made waves. a few years ago now, when he talked about the fact that there's good evidence for evolution. And one of the points I personally make, the way that I sort of frame this is, I'll go a little further. Answers in Genesis and the I shouldn't call them out specifically. I would say mainstream creationism. Okay, whatever that is, basic mainstream creationism sort of has the idea about, well, you're looking at the world in two different ways, right? And you've got sort of a naturalistic way of interpreting the evidence and a creationist way of interpreting the evidence. So they'll at least go there. But then mainstream creationism, I would say, tends to stop there. And then they don't ever give the evolutionists much credit for what they believe. They kind of just say that they're crazy for believing it, even though they started out by saying that there was two different ways to look at the evidence. And Dr. Wood, he kind of made some waves when he said, well, if you look at the evidence through the lens of an evolutionary uniformitarian worldview, it kind of makes sense. If you look at it from a creationist worldview, it kind of makes sense. And everybody on both sides has questions. But there's no like big massive conspiracy of scientists who are just anti-creationists. There's some who are, but most of them are just kind of living naturally within their worldview. So with all that as a preface, I guess the question I'm trying to ask you is, where do you sort of see, and I know you're not a scientist and you can feel free to give whatever caveats there you want to, but where do you sort of see the state of the evidence today, or the state of the topic today? How do you feel about how the evolutionists see their evidence and how the creationists see their evidence? Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And yes, I do really appreciate Todd Wood. People like him and Kurt Wise are some of the creationists that I'm most impressed by. And I think Todd Wood is right that there is lots of evidence that that you can reasonably argue for both evolution and for an old Earth, and we should not be dismissive of that, because this is one of the biggest mistakes that creationists have made, is that you try to present someone who believes in evolution as, oh, they're a fool, that they just don't understand. And that's actually not the case at all. There's lots of good reasons why someone would accept the theory of evolution and such. And so we should not be dismissive of this. And this sort of goes back, back in high school when I sort of was thinking, oh, I just have to give one creationist book and they read it, and like, no, actually, it's not nearly as simple as that at all. And in terms of the state of the evidence and the state of creationist research, again, not being a scientist, but it's kind of, in one sense, I find that as I think about this topic, that creationism it's something that there's a lot of challenges to it, and the challenges are really big, and we can't gloss over them. And at the same time, there's reason to be optimistic that this state of the quality of the research that the real creation scientists, the ones with the real PhDs that are doing the hard science, the quality of that research is actually substantially improved. I mean, you compare the research that's happening now to the early stuff that was put up by the Creation Research Society, and there's just simply no comparison. It is far better now, but as it gets better, it's actually becoming more like mainstream science, and then it's becoming more nuanced. It's becoming a lot more, we've got a hypothesis here, but we have to look at these different angles. And so even as the state of the quality of creationist research improves, the ability to just simply, I'm going to argue with someone and prove them that this is the correct worldview, actually becomes a lot more difficult. And because we actually don't have those simple arguments that used to be used. I mean, it was so much fun back in the day of arguing that. I remember using these, the shrinking sun and the moon dust, and we don't have those because those turned out not to be correct. It turned out the evidence actually didn't support those, and instead you've got far more complex arguments. Arguments based on the like clastic dikes and soft sediment deposition, and like this stuff's way more complicated. And but it's the sign of a worldview that I think is matured. And so I think that as creationism matures, that you actually have a better, you're getting closer to a more comprehensive, cohesive worldview. But it just, if you think back in time, you think of those creation evolution debates that, in particular, Gish used to participate in, and typically Gish would win those debates largely because the evolution scientists weren't very good at explaining their views to a popular audience, and they knew how nuanced it was, and Gish just had his presentation timed, and it's kind of like those evolution scientists at the time, they were having to explain really complex technical stuff with all these caveats up against a creationist who had everything dot 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 all memorized and just spew it out. And nowadays, the most credible creation scientists are the ones who have actually become, in some ways, a lot like those evolution scientists in how they present it, not in the worldview, but in how it's presented. And so, as creationism becomes more sophisticated, it means that it's frankly harder to explain to a mainstream audience. I mean, the basic biblical stuff is pretty straightforward, and some of the basic scientific stuff. But as far as really getting into it, it's gotten more complicated. And why shouldn't it? I mean, that's kind of how science operates.
Yeah. Right? No, it should. In fact, and the more that's a good word, sophisticated, right? The more sophisticated it becomes, the more I would say credible that it becomes. And you're right, the quality of the research has certainly improved. I was at the ICC, the International Conference on Creationism, last year, and I had the distinct pleasure of sitting in at a table. In conversation with a few awesome gentlemen from the New Creation blog, and also Kurt Wise, and I mean, I seriously sat there for like 4 hours, essentially just listening to Kurt talk, and boy, that was literally phenomenal. I mean, just the man's passion and zest and zeal for creationism is so evident and so apparent. And one of the big things that he was talking about was that when they initially, dreamed up the ICC, it was because the current sort of creation conferences and things that were going on, it was a madhouse. I mean, it might even be something that I can't remember the exact example that he used, but I mean, the example I'm going to go to is something like, like Roswell, New Mexico, or something like that. Like everybody was there. Like everybody had their alien theories, and it was a real mess. It wasn't very scientific or scholarly at all. And he said even the first ICC had a little bit of that too, and they tightened it down and cracked down. And I would say that just every year since then has gotten progressively better. That I would say most of the journals have, for the most part, gotten better. Some of the research that gets admitted is still a little questionable, in my opinion, but I think most of it that comes in is good, and there's usually good back and forth arguments. You can't really say that much in creationism these days without being challenged. I mean, you're going to get challenged about it from another scientist, which is encouraging. And so, yeah, the quality of the research is there. We certainly need more researchers in each field. That's another interesting thing that I'm seeing is I see, and I'm by no means, I mean, my audience is way too small to take any credit at all for this. But I'm so excited to see that most of the new creationists that are popping up that I'm seeing are very much in this more winsome, more guarded, more cautious, more understanding of both sides, and less controversial ilk. You know what I mean? There's I think there's well, again, I'm hesitant to say too much here, but like a lot of the staff at some of these other organizations are sort of old guard, and there's very few new people coming in who are willing to say some of the things that some of the old guard would say. And I think that's for the most part, a very good thing. I mean, again, I have friends who work at all the, in all the mainstream creationist places. And so I don't have specific problems, with them, but just in general, I'm seeing way more of this sort of open-minded attitude. And that feels like a really good thing to me.
It is. And one thing that's been important to me for quite some time is for the more credible creationists to distance themselves from those who are presenting creationism in a poor light. And I'll name a couple here. I mean, I suspect Kent Hovind, for example. I mean, he's one of the worst examples in terms of
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
having the qualifications and presenting a whole bunch of stuff that's been debunked a long time ago. And Answers in Genesis actually did put out a rebuttal prior to the split with Creation Ministries International called "Arguments Creationists Should Not Use." And I was glad that they did that, and they quoted a lot of his stuff. So Kent Hovind, Carl Baugh, were their enthusiasm I understand, but their approach just wasn't acceptable, particularly when it was corrected by other creationists who were pointing out that stop using some of these arguments. And they're not credible. And the tone that they were using wasn't very good either. And so I had no problem, and of distancing myself if there's a creationist argument that's been debunked, I'll be the first to say it. That's something that Kurt Wise has always said. He'll be the first to, if the evidence doesn't go along with something, he'll openly acknowledge it. And this was something that was made very clear in the section about him in Ron Number's book, The Creationist, which everyone should read if you're interested in this topic, because there's fascinating history in there. And Ron Numbers passed away just a short time ago, but I appreciated his historical work. There's a lot of good information to be gleaned from the history of creationism, because it's a movement with a fascinating history. And so anyone who's interested in the topic should know about the history and should know about people like Harry Rimmer and George McCready Price, even sort of the predecessors to Morris and the Institute for Creation Research and such.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I want to echo what you said, like massive credit to those who have distanced themselves and who, I remember, reading those posts about, hey, these are some of the arguments that creationists shouldn't use. And they are listed and pretty regularly updated. I think that I'd like to see some improvement there. I'll just, for example, the researchers are pretty convinced that there were some dinosaurs who had feathers. Okay, this is just one example. And I think that a lot of the opposition that I'm seeing from those in, again, quote unquote, mainstream creationism to this idea is a lot more about, well, we've said for 2 decades that dinosaurs don't have feathers, and so now if we suddenly agree that they do, we have egg on our face. Unfortunately, I think that's what it looks like. I'm not saying that there's not good arguments that you could make on both sides, but again, the subject matter experts who are committed creationists seem to think that, okay, yeah, there were some dinosaurs who had feathers. And I think that just using that as an example, I think that when creationists hold on to bad arguments for whatever reason, that they're holding on to them, then that casts doubt on the creationist enterprise in general. And it even buys into, because a lot of the narrative with the whole dinosaurs having feathers thing, a lot of that narrative is really about debunking this idea that dinosaurs evolved into birds. And I think that if you latch on to this opposition to dinosaurs having feathers because that somehow creates a closer connection between dinosaurs and birds, then you implicitly sort of buy into the idea that dinosaurs became birds, when really you could just say, yeah, some kinds of dinosaurs had feathers and birds have feathers, and they still did not evolve one into the other. Those are 2 separate categories of things, just like bats have wings and birds have wings, but they're clearly separate kinds of organisms. So I don't know if you have an opinion on that, but I think that's just an example of somewhere where we can be a lot more careful.
Yeah, the last time I checked, the Bible doesn't say anything about whether dinosaurs had feathers or not. I mean, so if we have to go where the evidence points, and this is when you're too dogmatic on a particular aspect of the creationist model. Frankly, of getting any sort of model that's sort of that extrapolates from the Bible. I mean, this is when, you think back to, 30, 40 years when the flood canopy was all the rage in creationist circle, that there was a canopy of water vapor that used to circle the earth. And modern day creationists have long since moved away from that because the evidence doesn't support it. But again, there were some creationists that kind of held on to that one far too long, even though the evidence was not supporting it. And it wasn't biblically mandated at all. There was no need to hold to that. And so we can sort of learn from some of those areas where it's changed, and hold tentatively to some of the particulars. And so getting into debating about could dinosaurs have feathers and all that, I don't really care. If some had feathers, okay, fine. So what? Let's move on.
Mm. Yeah, and I think that having humility about that is also part of being winsome. It's what's so interesting to me is that creationists have been mean to the other side for so long that now, as creationists are sort of making a shift towards being more nuanced, there's a lot of evolutionists kind of attacking back at creationists the way that creationists used to behave, unfortunately. And so, but I think the best thing as people interested in science and interested in being a Christian and interested in the truth is to be humble and to realize that, reading the Bible is different from crafting a model in the world of science that may or may not agree with the Bible, and we can hold to biblical truth while understanding that some of our models may fail and will be improved upon over time. Many of them, and again, some we might have to throw out entirely. Some we might reach consensus on and be pretty happy with. But the biblical models or the scientific models rather are not the Bible, and vice versa. So,
and
as long
what's
as
funny
we
about this is that
keep that
this
separate,
is yeah. And what's funny about this is that this advice is true of whether you are like a young Earth creationist, an old Earth creationist, or a evolutionary creationist or theistic
Yeah.
evolutionist, depending what term you use. Because I guarantee, because I have some of these books. If you read, let's say go 40, 50 years back and read some of the old Earth creationist stuff or the theistic evolutionist stuff, a lot of their science doesn't fit with contemporary research and all that, where there were details that have
Mhm.
simply changed. I mean, science changes. So whichever brand of creationism or even of evolution, the details of the science changes over time, no matter which of the perspectives you hold. So be careful when you've got a particular model that be willing to adapt according to the evidence. It doesn't mean throw out your worldview, but it does mean that be prepared to modify some of the details, because that is how science operates, regardless of your worldview.
Yeah, science is naturally tentative, right? Is a good way to
Yep.
put it. Which is kind of why I am puzzled. I have to admit, by those who sort of take the direction of using science to reinterpret their understanding of the Bible instead of the other way around. Because science is fundamentally tentative, and Scripture is fundamentally not tentative. It's fundamentally the opposite in its own claims and in its implications. And so I've always found that curious and a talking point, at least when I am discussing with theistic evolutionists and old Earth creationists, because I'm genuinely curious why they use the science, which we know changes a lot over time and quickly. Why they sort of use that to shift their understanding of the Bible instead of the other way around. I mean, I'm not sure if there's a more charitable way to put that, but I mean that's basically what seems to be happening. So
Yeah, and one point I'll make, and this is a point that I made in the Three Views in Creation Evolution course I taught at Simon Baba College, is that the interesting thing is when you look at the three main Christian options: young Earth creationism, old Earth creationism, and theistic evolution. It's old Earth creationism which tends to be the most concordist, meaning that does the most effort to try to have the Bible and science line up most precisely. You see that very clearly in Hugh Ross's ministry, Reasons to Believe. And while I think he does a lot of good work, I think he goes overboard on trying to sort of line up the Bible exactly with contemporary science, particularly when you're dealing with cosmology and Big Bang and all that. Theistic evolution sort of tries to separate the Bible from science, saying, the Bible's not, doesn't really have anything to say about science. We'll just go with the science. And young Earth creationists tend to say, you know what? Yes, we think that the Bible and science, would properly understood, will harmonize, but is also willing to say, we challenge many of the consensus statements of mainstream science. And so young Earth creationism is largely non-concordist in that they're challenging many of the aspects of the conclusions of mainstream science. Theistic evolution is also generally non-concordist, saying, the Bible isn't saying anything about science. And it's the old Earth creationists that are the most concordist. And that is actually the perspective that you run into some of the most problems, where you're the most dependent. Oh boy, the science it better not change, or else my model is going to run into some serious problems. And so that's something that I've sort
yeah.
of come to conclude, that out of the three main perspectives, it's old Earth creationism that kind of is running into the biggest risk in terms of you're really trying to match the Bible and the current science,
Yeah.
and you'd better hope the current science doesn't change too much, or else you've got a problem with, you look at reasons to believe their creation model, it is so heavily concordist, they run into some big problems. I mean, just as a case in point, that we're Neanderthals, like fully human and all that, and reasons to believe is adamant that they're not. But the science, including in mainstream science, is increasingly coming to the conclusion that they are, and that's why William Lane Craig, in his research on the original Adam, concluded, well, Neanderthals, they're fully human, so we've got to put Adam and Eve back to 750,000 years because that's how he had to sort of line it up there. And so this stuff's just all very interesting in terms of in terms of how we balance the Bible and science.
Oh yeah, it's one of those topics that I keep coming back to on the podcast here, and it's interesting because you're right. I mean, the old Earth perspective is by far the most concordist. I mean, there are some crazy examples of just of Hugh Ross and looking at a Bible verse and saying, well, this Bible verse means the laws of physics are never changed or whatever. And it may be true that the laws of physics have never changed. I'm not suggesting that. What I am suggesting is that the Bible does not say anything about the laws of physics.
It doesn't say anything.
So, strictly speaking,
Yeah.
It was interesting though to hear you just now say that young Earth creationism is largely non-concordist. I am thrilled and I think anybody who's sort of like in the know on in modern creation studies and tends to be on the more into the scholarly side of creationism more, I think recognizes this. I think that in years gone by, and there's still a lot of very public perception incorrect, I think, that think it's the other way. There's a lot of people that think young Earth creationism is heavily concordist still. I do think that is shifting. But there for a while, I mean, most of Henry Morris's early material was concordist in the sense that, yeah, it wasn't trying to align the Bible with mainstream science, but it was trying to pretty closely align the Bible with specific ideas and even specific models in science. And I'm glad to see creationists distancing ourselves from that particular mindset, because it gives you so much more freedom to understand the Bible on its own terms, the science on its own terms, and then integrate them both without causing this unnecessary clash in the middle,
Absolutely. The era of going to the book of Job to find verses to show that the earth is round as opposed to flat, like that's just not helpful. And as much as, again, all the good work that Henry Morris did, his 1984 book, The Bible and Modern Science, is kind of a classic example of young Earth creationist concordism. And that's why there's so much in the book that's now outdated, because he was trying so hard to line up the Bible with science, and then the science changed, or it turns out he was wrong in some things, and then the book has now become hopelessly out of date. And so I think the more mature creationists, or the ones that are doing the hardcore research, are increasingly non-concordist. And again, this doesn't mean that the Bible contradicts science. It's simply that it's recognizing that the Bible is not a scientific textbook. It's a book that gives important information, and I do hold to biblical inerrancy. But inerrancy doesn't mean that that the Bible is proclaiming on every topic out there. The Bible, there's a lot of things the Bible doesn't tell me anything about. It doesn't tell me how to change oil in my car or change tires, and it doesn't give me the details of creation. It gives a basic framework that we operate within, but it does not give the details. And because that's for us to research and all that. I mean, it doesn't give us every historical detail. It certainly doesn't give every scientific detail, nor should we expect it to.
Yeah. Now, one interesting thing, and I've never, I don't know that I've ever had a personal conversation with somebody as well read on this topic and the histories of this topic like you are. So this is really fascinating. I am curious on one specific thing that you mentioned. So I'm with you. I'm not going to the book of Job like creationists of the past have to try to learn things about necessarily the shape of the earth or anything like that. But now I am very intrigued by some of the things that I do read in Job that I don't exactly know what say a historical or ancient referent for that idea might be that sure sounds like something in modern science. So I don't know if you have an opinion on this, but like the two that I always go back to are the verse where Job says, it talks about the earth hanging on nothing. I'm like, wow, that's really fascinating. That really sounds like something that you couldn't have possibly known. And so I'm curious your thoughts on that. And then the other one is where Job talks about springs in the sea. That one has always fascinated me. Perhaps there's something entirely different, ancient, that he's referring to when he says springs in the sea. But it sure sounds like the thing that we didn't discover until the 1970s. So I admit I have a few things where I am very much a non-concordist, but there's a few of those old things where I'm still not sure what they mean if they don't mean something relevant to to modern science. Do you have any thoughts on those things?
Yeah, it's always possible, but like I have definitely with the Book of Job, I'm very reluctant to use the Book of Job to make any kind of pronouncement on a scientific topic, because Job is definitely not a book of science. I mean, it's not even really it's not a creation account per se. It's a book that deals largely with with the question of suffering, and the conversation between God and the adversary Satan. And there's obviously a lot of poetry in the book. And I have read, for example, Morris's the remarkable record of Job. And and I remember with my enthusiasm at the time is, oh, look at, it's so obvious what the behemoth and the leviathan are. But the reality is that it's not obvious at all. And so there are definitely some passages in there that make you wonder, and it's possible. But I'm just not prepared. I'm far less prepared now than I was in the past to sort of mine Job for any kind of scientific insights. I mean, because you got to remember, Job in the context there, he's suffering, he's scraping the pus off his arms or whatever, and he's arguing with his friends who are sort of telling him that it's his sin and all that's the problem, and that's what they're grappling with. And I just don't think Job is doing a whole lot of scientific enlightenment at that time. I think he's just honestly wrestling, and he's saying, how he truly feels. And if it does happen to be that some of the passages are sort of giving a little bit of insight into in terms of the world actually operates scientifically, that's great. I'm not going to dismiss that, but I myself, I'm just not prepared to make that argument from a book like Job. I think we have to be very careful.
Yeah.
It's one thing to be reading Genesis 1 and 2, and there's definitely much more of a historical kind of narrative to it, but you don't have that historical narrative in the Book of Job or in Psalms and such.
Totally agree. Yeah, and I think that's a perfectly balanced way to approach it. I mean, that's kind of where I'm at right now. Is like I'm way too tentative to try to make some sort of argument for modern science from the Book of Job, while at the same time admitting, okay, there's some stuff here that I really don't understand in an ancient context what it could have been referring to, and it sure sounds like something that we can look out into the world and observe today that they couldn't have possibly known about back then. And so I love that. I think it's a good balanced approach to take. I'm the same way, even with the behemoth, leviathan stuff. Hey, look, if it turns out that those are dinosaurs, fantastic. We do have some ancient reference points for those things of things that they could be, looking around in the ancient world that don't necessarily map to dinosaurs per se. But even then, I think there's good arguments that some have made that a real animal is being discussed, and if a real animal is being discussed, then again, it's perhaps more likely that it's something like a dinosaur than something else. But still, even that is a discussion that it's fun to have, but like you're not making any arguments, from the Book of Job. I'm not looking for dinosaurs in my Bible anymore, and I think I have to admit there's a little bit of a I'm not sure the right word, nostalgia, especially if you've been into creationism for a long time, or just there's this sort of real excitement about that, a magic almost that you might think kind of gets lost. You might think kind of gets lost when you can't go there anymore, right? I'm sure the day that you finally did have that moment where you realized you can't go to the Book of Job and just mine it for modern scientific truths. I'm sure that was at first a a little bit depressing. But my experience has been that once you do understand the truth of the matter and you do understand how rich the Bible is and what really is true that we can glean from the biblical data to help us form, modern scientific ideas and models, to me, it got more exciting after I got past that initial point.
I would agree. And I just, in terms of the book of Job, I think I read it a lot better now and get a lot more out of it now that I've stopped just trying to find dinosaurs and behemoth and Leviathan, because that's not the theme of the book. It's not it's not what it's focusing on. And it's certainly, you think of Dwayne Gish's book, Dinosaurs, Those Terrible Lizards, where he's speculating that, they might have been, that might have breathed out fire because he's, and such. That was fun reading those at the time, but it's almost like, and if I could make this comparison, it's kind of like, the older creationists, it was kind of like, you get the sugar high, but if you're just having sugar all the time, it's not going to sustain you on a longer term basis. And so, if you take sort of a more, if you recognize the nuance, you recognize that, look, certain things change, and this isn't as simple as we initially thought, that you're having your meat and potatoes. And the meat and potatoes version of creation research is much, much better in the long run for your health than the sugar high of looking for proof texts and looking for the zinger argument that's just going to completely obliterate the other side. So that way everyone has no choice but to change their mind.
Yeah, totally. All right, so I want to shift gears and ask you a little question here about something else. So, I know, like you described already at one point, where you sort of had a watershed moment, if you will, after reading that book, of understanding, turns out creationists don't know everything, and they're wrong about some things, and that that leads to some places. But I'm kind of curious in your own life if you had another watershed moment that led you to following the work of guys like Kurt Weiss, Todd Wood, Paul Garner, John Whitmore, like those kinds of people, because you got to admit, man, there's more overlap today. But now, back when I first started my first creation podcast, which was in 2016, and literally like the second episode of that podcast was titled "The New Creationism." I was talking about Paul Garner's book, and I had, at the time, there was a lot of polarization. I mean, you were kind of either in the camp of the big three creation organizations, or you were in sort of the is Genesis history, Kurt Weiss, Todd Wood, like people associated with that. There was a little bit of overlap, but especially in like the public consciousness, you were kind of either a fan of one or the other. And again, it was their own doing, so I'm just going to call them out. Answers in Genesis somewhat doubled down on this idea last year when they started coming out with their series on so-called young Earth evolution. And of course, they didn't mention anywhere throughout the series that so much of the research in their attractions relies on the very people that they were sort of denigrating. But and again, I don't want to be mean, I want to be winsome, but the reality is they're the ones who did this. They doubled down on it when Ken Ham wrote a ministry statement, taking responsibility for the articles and doubling down on it. So, I'm curious if you had, and what it looked like, a watershed moment that sort of led you to these other folks in creationism, or what that looked like to you, and how has your sort of experience of creationism or perception of the whole thing changed since sort of going more towards that way?
Yeah, there wasn't one watershed moment. It initially was gradual. In fact, even going back to high school, because I read so widely, I did start to get exposed. Even when I read Ron Number's book, The Creationists, and I was able to read about the difference between the more credible creationists and the ones that were less credible. I know that one who I still admire, and that I admired back then, was Steve Austin. He kind of, in some ways, Steve Austin kind of straddled the fence, where he was part of the Institute for Creation Research and worked with them, but he was their field research guy, where he was doing real geology, had a real PhD from Penn State University, and he was good friends with Ken Ham, and so he was sort of largely a bridge in that regard, and so I sort of gravitated to a lot of his stuff. So when Grand Canyon book came out in 1994, I scooped that one up right away, because I wanted to sort of read, okay, like he's a real geologist. How does he interpret some of these things? Because this, and so that was definitely impactful on me. And just in terms of my background, in terms of how I shifted a little bit, I actually had wanted back in the day to, I'm going to go into science and I'm going to be a creation scientist. And in my first year at the University of Manitoba, I took all science courses, and I found out within my first couple of months that actually I'm not that good at like hard science. I'm not good at telling one rock from another and scraping the thing and doing the chemistry. And so I ended up leaving that program in the following year, going into education and history and politics. And because I found that even when I did my reading on creationism, I liked the history angle and sort of some of that as opposed to the details of scientific calculations. And in that process as well, it also kind of helped make me more well-rounded, because I was able to look at not just getting into the weeds of the science, but just sort of the broader, how are arguments made. And I was able to see that, there's different qualities of argument. Like some arguments are better than others. And I could discern pretty quickly, okay, this is just rhetoric. They're using an argumentation style to try to get around the fact they actually don't have very good evidence here. And you could tell the difference when someone is arguing from the edge of their knowledge, where they really don't know much about this, but they're bluffing, and versus sort of like in a poker game where you can tell if someone's bluffing or not, and or if they actually really know this stuff. So you listen to someone like Kurt Wise and you're going, he's not bluffing, he actually knows this stuff. And so that's again part of the reason that I gravitate toward the side that I don't want to be bluffing. And that's why it's important to be careful and to be cautious and to not overstate things, because your hand gets exposed as not being very good. So it's important that we be careful on this and to be as accurate as we can be.
I love that. And there's still, it's odd. There's still kind of this idea among so many creationists that, like, if you criticize another creationist's work or something like that, that you're in a sense harming the church, or like confusing people. Like that was sort of the basis for the article series in Answers in Genesis. Sort of the foundational argument they were making is, well, this group over here says, this group over here gives too much credit to evolution and not enough credit to creationists. Therefore, they're causing confusion and harming the church. That was kind of like, their argument. And, but shouldn't we seek to like understand the best of both sides, right? I mean, shouldn't we use the best arguments we could possibly find for evolution if we're going to be talking about evolution? And shouldn't we use the best arguments we could possibly find for creation if we're going to talk about creation? That just seems like common sense to me. And so I'm not sure why it's a bad thing to to give credit where it's due for work that's been done. In fact, I think that just creates a little bit more credibility, in the field of science, because, it's harsh out there. I mean, it's very unforgiving. So.
Well, absolutely. And the reality is iron sharpens iron. And so I would hope that that creationists are correcting each other and are pointing out where there's errors and where challenging each other's models that they put forward, because that's how you do better. I mean, that's why our legal system is based on the premise of the adversarial system, where two sides present the case to the strongest possible ability, and then when that happens,
Yes.
then you're most likely to get to the truth. And again, it's not perfect, because no system that we have designed is perfect, but that's how we operate. That's how we try to determine whether someone is guilty or not guilty. You have the best possible prosecutor putting forward a case, and then you have the best possible defense lawyer critiquing that, picking it apart, and that's how we should operate. And so it does not bother me in the least if one Christian is critiquing the arguments, not the person, but critiquing the arguments put forward by another Christian. And that's why I can appreciate the work and the ministries of different organizations. And even though obviously, like I prefer one perspective over another, there's a lot that I can say. I have a lot of positive things I can say about Hugh Ross. Like Hugh Ross is amazing in a lot of
Yeah.
ways. You watch him on the Unbelievable podcast with Justin Barley debating atheist Peter Atkins. Like, whoa, like Hugh Ross is really good when he's in his element. Showing that, look,
Hmm.
here's the evidence for a God, and Peter Atkins really had nothing in response there. And frankly, and this is heresy in creationist circles. There's a lot of stuff that comes out from BioLogos, which is a theistic evolutionist organization. That's good stuff. They're doing important work, and I
Yeah.
can appreciate that God can be at work in the ministry of organizations, even if they have some of their facts and interpretations wrong. Just because you're wrong on certain things doesn't automatically mean that every single thing that you say is bad and is not helpful. That's why I don't lose sleep over the fact that we've got different denominations. Yes, it doesn't mean that they're all right on
Yeah.
everything. Of course not. I mean, on the issue of baptism, I mean, either it's believers baptism or infant baptism. One side's right and the other side's wrong. I've got my view on it. But at the end of the day, I don't think that God is only present in churches that do baptism the correct way. And having different denominations, it's not this terrible thing that people make it out to be. Yes, I mean, we should be more unified than we are, but at the same time, God didn't give us a Bible that is just perfectly understandable on every detail. As people, we're
Yeah.
meant to wrestle with the text and debate it. I mean, go to Acts chapter 15 and look at how the apostles dealt with the question of should Gentiles have to be circumcised. They didn't just wait. They didn't have a vision come down from heaven. You read the text, it says
Right.
that they studied and they debated, and then they wrote the letter saying it seemed good to the Holy Spirit and to us. This is the apostles. This is like Peter and Paul and group, and they said it seemed good to the Holy Spirit and to us. And so if they had to wrestle with the text and debate, and they're the apostles, it's okay for us to do that, and we
Yeah.
don't have to lose sleep over the fact that, well, we might get some stuff wrong. Yes, we might. Odds are, there's a 99.9% chance that I'm wrong in a whole bunch of stuff. That's just how it is. I mean,
Yeah.
I just don't think I'm blessed with the unique ability to get everything right all the time. So let's just acknowledge that.
Yeah, this is something I'm extremely passionate about, and me and a buddy, we just met before you and I started talking here. I was at a coffee shop and met with my buddy. We're going to be taking over our couples class in Sunday school from a couple that is unfortunately leaving us, and we were just talking about the same thing. We're excited about the opportunity to take the class in this direction because I feel like so many Christians are just completely unaware that so much of the New Testament, I mean, especially the book of Acts, is literally an inspired account of human beings wrestling and working through problems. I mean, again, I really think that most people miss this, even people who read their Bible every year as part of a 1-year Bible reading program or something. I think most people just really miss the nuance in the text that it's not as though these things are coming like dictums down directly from heaven. They are being thought about and taught about, and arguments are being made and considered, and it's based on the statement and the actions of Jesus. It's checked against the Old Testament. It's in some cases done. I mean, the idea, the notion I hear because I studied this recently, that when you see the words like it seemed good, that notion in the New Testament, what I understand is that the Greek word for that kind of carries the idea of a majority vote by hands in a sense.
Yep.
And so you literally have them just deciding. You have them making the decisions of what the future is going to be like, and you've got the Apostle Paul under the inspiration of God somehow saying, I don't have a command from God on this thing, but here's what I believe since you asked. And so that's not to take away from the inspiration of the Bible. Of course not. I believe it's inspired, infallible, and all of those buzzwords. At the same time, like to remove the element of humanity from it would be a huge mistake, because then what happens is we fail to do those human things in our lives, and we fail to consider, and we're just looking for the Bible to spell out every little detail, and it's never going to do that because the Bible doesn't change, but it is supposed to help us think, and we can look at their reasoning processes and their thinking processes and see how they came to important decisions, and we can do the same thing. So
Yep.
yeah, I mean, I think that's all very important.
Yeah, no, I would agree. And the Bible in terms of the basic gospel, it's so simple that a 4-year-old can understand it. as far as
Yeah,
diving into the depths of biblical interpretation and the depths of the gospel message, we'll never fully understand it. It's a simple book and yet remarkably complicated at the same time. And which seems to me to indicate that it might be that it's inspired by God, which is how
that's
you
a
can have a book that is both simple and deeply complex.
absolutely. I think that's one of the best arguments for inspiration is just is just the incredible simplicity and yet incredible complexity of the whole thing. And um, just to kind of pivot back to the creation stuff for a minute, like I know for me, what I'm really interested in, and where it's so funny because honestly, a lot of my podcast to this point has been groundwork. I mean, I think I started it in December of 2022, I think is when I restarted this podcast up. And we've been doing it. I missed a week or two, but for the most part, twice a month. And a lot of it so far has actually been critiquing creationist thought and just really trying to reframe the way people think about this subject, and we're going to continue doing that. But one thing with this podcast that I'd really like to start doing more of specifically is putting people in touch with the model building approach. And I'm sure you have thoughts on this, but like I think we've just about reached not the limits because there's always new stuff coming out, but I would say that like at this point, I think creationists should be focused at least 3-1 on building the creation model versus just tearing down evolution. And unfortunately, I mean, if you go to a lot of creationist websites today, the top 5 articles that you see, and there's usually the most recent articles that have been written, are just more arguments against evolution. And I think that's really unfortunate. Man, I really think more and more of us need to be focused on researching and just highlighting the work of the researchers who are building the creation model, don't you?
Absolutely, and the creation, this model building approach, it's difficult, it's time consuming, and what's interesting is that if you look at the history of creationism, there have been creationists who have been doing this, and they tend to, at least until more recently, haven't been the more high profile ones. So your listeners, if you like, for case in point, the 1984 book by Lane P. Lester, "The Natural Limits of Biological Change." Lane Lester used to be on the staff years ago of the Institute for Creation Research, and he openly says in the book, we need to do less, evolution bashing and more building up the creation model. And the tone of the book is actually very much, we're going to make a sort of a systematic, biblical, and scientific case here, and with a more model building approach. And so but of course, I suspect even most modern day creationists go, "Who's Lane Lester?" But
Yeah.
because again, he wasn't bombastic, he wasn't doing a lot of the debates. But he'd be an example of someone that was doing that. Another creationist, the Seventh-day Adventist Harold Coffin, in his book Origin or Design, you kind of see a similar approach that he takes, a very moderate, measured, tempered tone, sort of just taking, like, sort of saying, we're going to build a case here gradually, look at the different models here. And again, it's the reason that it's hard to do that is that it's often not that exciting, and you get more clicks if you sort of make the more kind of bold claim and say, "I'm going to prove that the Bible is true with 3 simple facts," and we'll sort of do that. But it's a lot more complex saying, "I'm going to make the case that this particular interpretation of the flood is the best. This is where the post and the pre-flood line is actually." That's just it's getting into the weeds. But if you actually want to build a model that's going to sustain itself over the long term, that is what you ultimately have to do. And it's hard work, and I'm glad there are people who are doing it.
Yeah, I agree, and I'm sort of I don't know. This is very much just thinking out loud and personal reflection. But I was thinking about this earlier that um, you know I mean, I realize my work is as a popularizer, but if I could make a contribution, and I was actually going to even ask you if you've ever thought about writing a book on this subject. I've actually got a book that I've got a book about half written that I was calling the Winsome Creationist, and then I basically had to stop that because I was teaching a creation class at church. And between the two, I've got 80,000 words. I've got enough for a book. So I'm thinking about actually putting them together and just going ahead and releasing one. But I like this idea of sort of helping a lot of the people who do the model building approach, because they're so busy researching, they don't have time to make their arguments more popularly accessible, and put them out there. So I think it would be a really cool ministry to sort of help with that, and help put some writing, some lay communication to the technical side of the research, and get more of that out there. Because again, there is just less of it today. I mean, there's some that's out there, but most of it out there today is still, anti-evolution, and
Yep.
I think we're going to
And
have to do better than that.
well, if you've got Steve, if you've got 80,000 words, you should be putting your book out. And I think this would be very interesting. And I would agree that it's often those who are best at building up the model aren't always the best writers for a popular audience because it's a different style of writing. There aren't a lot of
Yeah,
people who are able to do that. And so, and whatever your worldview happens to be, if you're able to understand some of the key aspects of the material and explain it. I mean, and again, I'm a teacher, so this is what I do for a living is taking complex things and making them simple.
yeah,
And so that's what I sought to do in this course that I taught at Islamic Bible College as well. So, teaching for a lay audience, even though I'm a lay person myself who's done a fair bit of reading on the topic, so I can sort of distill it. And so yes,
yeah.
if you've got a bunch of things written down on this, if it's anything like your podcast, I think it'd be worth reading. So get the book out and let me know, and I'll get a copy.
Very kind. Very kind. Thank you. Okay, actually, this was a good segue because I think we can sort of wrap up by maybe talking a little bit more about your three views. I think it was a three views
Yep,
class that you did. And so you can tell me as much about that class as you'd like
sure.
to. And if you want to share some of the content just in brief, you certainly can. But what I really want to highlight is your winsome approach to how you handle the subject, and really an emphasis on how you teach the subject, and firmly teaching creationism while emphasizing that we can be nice to our brothers and sisters with whom we disagree.
Yeah, well, the course it was a 1 credit course, and so it was there were students at the Bible college who took it, but it was also open for audit to members of the community, and so you had an interesting mix there. And I divided up into 4 2.5 hour or 3 hour sessions, I guess, or 2.5 hours when you factor in the break. The first session, I basically spent just outlining what the different perspectives are and just a lot of the history, like giving the history of the creationist movement, the history of some of the old Earth creationist stuff, really focusing on Hugh Ross in particular, and then the history, kind of the different ways of understanding theistic evolution or evolutionary creation. And then for each of the following classes, I spent the first 2/3 making the case for that model. So, making the case for young Earth creationism, and then in the next class, making the case for the old Earth creationist and model, and then the third class, making the case for theistic evolution. And then in the final third of each of the sessions, doing everything I could to rip it apart. And so I made the case and then took it apart. Made the case, took it apart. Made the case, took it apart. And again, I told the class, like, the point here isn't to change your mind. The point here is to expose you to how different Christians think about this topic, and so that you better understanding that a Christian isn't stupid because they disagree with you. Because look, you could make a reasonable case. Here's the case, and I think I made a pretty reasonable case for each of the views. And I know this because at the end of the class, before revealing what my personal view was, I just asked them, because they were asking me, okay, what is your personal view on the very last day, at the very end? And I had said, okay, well, first of all, what do you think? And about 1/3 of the students thought I was a young Earth creationist, about 1/3 thought I was an old Earth creationist, and about 1/3 thought I was a theistic evolutionist. So I think I pulled it off in terms of presenting a reasonably balanced perspective.
That is so cool. That is really cool. I don't think there's anybody else, yeah, that must, yeah, that's a lot of talent. That's awesome. I mean, because most people I know would show their hand pretty quickly. I mean, I'm not that good. I show my hand pretty quickly. Like, look, here's what I believe. I don't believe this. I don't believe that. I try to make a fair case for them.
Yep.
But yeah, to be that balanced,
Well, a
kudos.
lot of
That's
this is a lot of
amazing.
what I do. Yeah, this is a lot of what I do for a living. Remember, I'm also a high school teacher, and so I teach courses like ethics and world religions. And I approach it pretty similarly, like particularly in the ethics class, where I'm challenging students. Doesn't matter what their worldview is. I'm making sure that you've got to understand how different people understand ethics and what you're basing them
Mm.
on. And often the students in my high school classes are left guessing what my views are, which is kind of funny because if all they have to do is if they just Google me and just put the topic. I write a lot on a lot of topics. It's not hard to find out what my opinion is if you're so desperate. But it's just funny in this internet age
Right.
that so many people haven't figured out. We'll just Google the person and find out what they think.
Yeah. Yeah. So Okay, so I mean, this is not a trick question, and we've probably talked about it already. But I guess if I were to ask you, like, what's the key, right? Like, what do you think is really the key to being able to approach the subject with balance?
Well, the key is having having a level of humility in terms of your own limitations, and understanding that while this is an important topic, it's not a salvation issue, and it's one that's okay that Christians have different views on this. It's not the end of the world if a fellow believer happens to hold a different view. And if you sort of take that, if you sort of lower the temperature, that you could still you can still go ahead and make your case for your perspective. You can still argue for it. You can still defend it. You can still teach it. But if you dial it back and go, you know what? I'm not going to convince everyone, and we don't want to overstate the topic. And again, one of the big problems that I see, like with Answers in Genesis, the Institute for Creation Research, is they overstate it, and they don't call it a salvation issue, but they come awfully close. They
Yeah,
say some really negative things about Hugh Ross, which I just don't think is appropriate. Hugh Ross does some amazing evangelism, so you don't need to dump on the guy that hard.
yeah,
Challenge him where you think he's wrong and point that out. But don't magnify this topic beyond what it should be. It's and a good measure of this. I mean, if you want to, what's the most important stuff in the Christian faith? Well, go to 1 Corinthians 15. Paul tells us. He says, here's what's of first importance. That Jesus Christ died and was buried and was resurrected, and like this is like fundamental, basic stuff. This is where we got to start, and then you build out from there. It doesn't mean that's all that we focus on, but it does mean that to have a certain level of humility, and if you're able to sort of recognize that, if you're able to sort of go, you know what, it's not the end of the world if people don't all agree with me. It's amazing how much more, frankly, enjoyable it is to look at this topic. Like I find this topic fun. I find it interesting. When I talk, people
yeah,
told me sometimes, that, oh, this course must have been really stressful. No, not really. It's fun. It was like I like the topic. I like talking about the
yeah,
history, and I like sort of making the case for different perspectives and all that. And but you can only do that if you're able to sort of take your personal emotion out of it and just sort of go, you know what, it's okay for Christians to have different views, and you don't need to get bent out of shape of the fact that some Christians are just going to interpret it differently. And you know what, that's just kind of how it operates. I mean, if God wanted us to just automatically all come to the same view, I think we would have been designed differently. I think that the
yeah.
Bible would have been a lot shorter and a lot simpler if that was how it's supposed to be, but it's not. So let's not get too worked up over this.
No, I couldn't possibly agree more. All right, so I have one more question for you, and then I'll let you go here. The last question's of a very practical nature. Before we do that, let me ask you this: is there somewhere that if people wanted to either engage with you or interact with you, or at least read your stuff online, is there somewhere easy to send them, or should they just Google your name, or how do you prefer?
Yeah, I mean, if you Google my name, that'll come up pretty quick. And so I do have a website. I believe it's still up. I haven't updated it for a bit, michaelzwaagstra.com. And it's got mostly my education writing, although I do have a little bit of biblical stuff on there, but it's mostly my mainstream, like on education policy writing. But it's got my contact information there. So it's got, my email and all that, which is easy enough to find.
Yeah,
Again, if you Google me, it's that might be your simplest approach, and then just whatever topic you're interested in. And some of the different think tanks I write for will have little sections about me and such. But I'm
cool.
full time teacher, part time counsel writer, and all that. So I don't have like a real true dedicated website and such.
Hmm. Okay, cool. Well, I can help with that. I'm a web designer by trade. So anyway, you let me know if you ever want to put one of those together, and we'll hook you up for
Oh,
sure.
good to know. Good to
Because
know.
I think it'd be super valuable to have even more of your thoughts online about all this stuff. So let me ask you a real practical question. I think there's probably a lot of people. So okay, it's hard to come away from this conversation without taking away. Holy cow! This guy reads a lot. And one of the things that probably is responsible for your balance and for the well of knowledge that you have on this is all of the reading that you've done. And I can imagine there's some people sitting at home saying, wow, I barely have enough time to read the creationist stuff, let alone all the other people's stuff. So I really just want to ask a super practical question. I know I have ways that I do this, but how do you read and retain so much? I mean, is there any sort of trick to it, or do you just make time for it and do it? Or
Yeah, there's no trick to it. It really is about making time and doing that. And I'm really glad that I still read now, obviously, but I read a lot more when I was younger, when I had a bit more time, and that was also an era before you had all the distractions of phones and all that, which I think is, as a teachers and educators, definitely damaged our attention spans and even impacted mine. It's kind of funny how often we've been interrupted by the phones, but it's really just it's about doing the work of actually doing the reading. There really is no trick. I just it's part of the reason I know a lot about this topic is because I read a lot about it, and you just can't. There's just no substitute for reading a lot about a topic in order to have any kind of reasonable expertise.
Yeah, absolutely. Couldn't agree more. Yeah, make time for it. I mean, wake up an hour earlier, go to bed an hour later, trade some TV time for
Yep.
reading. You'll at the end of the day, you'll just be amazed. I mean, there's people, I fool everybody. I mean, there are people in my church or whatever who are like, "Oh my goodness, you're such a genius." And I'm like, and I'm not saying that to like pat my own back or anything, because I don't believe I am, but it's just what other people say. How do you know so much? And it's like, honestly, it's not rocket science. Like, I really just care about it so much that I spend time reading about it, where you spend time doing other things that you care about. And it's like, I know zero about cars, but a lot of my friends love cars and they can tell you just anything about a car. And I'm like, you're no different than me. You just have a passion about different things. So if you want to become more knowledgeable in this topic, then hey, listen to the Winsome Creationist podcast. Go find some YouTube videos. Go read some books and dive in. I mean, the closest thing that I have to a hack is that I read almost everything on a Kindle and I highlight a lot. And I use this little app called Readwise that resurfaces 10 highlights for me every day. And part of my morning routine is to go through highlights, and you can even tune the algorithm. And so it'll give you books that you haven't read for a while, or it'll bias towards more recent ones. And you can just pick and choose how that goes. And so I go back and reread for retention the most memorable quotes of all the books that I've read in the past 5 or 6 years, or well, more than that now. I really became a reader in like 2014, so I guess about 10 years. And so yeah, that's how I do it. It's just I read a lot, highlight a lot, and then review the highlights every day, and stuff just kind of comes to you. It's really a simple system, but you gotta do it. There's no substitute for the hard work of just doing it.
Yep, that is the reality. Absolutely.
Yeah. All right. Well, hey, Michael, this has been such a pleasure, and I can guarantee that you will be back on this podcast probably very soon, because I'm sure there's so much more we could talk about. One thing I would love to dive in with you on is the history of creationism, because it sounds like you probably are very well read on that. I'd love to talk about the nuances there. There's a lot of misunderstanding around the idea of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and like there's misunderstanding on both sides as to how much or how little they were involved in modern young earth creationism. Did they make it up or did they not? That's all stuff that I would love to chat about with you at some point in the future. So I really appreciate you coming on. It's been an extreme pleasure.
Well, thank you very much, Steve. I've really enjoyed it, and absolutely be happy to come on and we can chat some history.
Amen. All right, brother. Thank you so much.
Thanks.